Some people walk into danger because they didn't prepare. Joel was not one of those people. He was 33 years old, 7 years of solo hiking behind him, the kind of man who knew the difference between a trail that forgave mistakes and one that didn't. He had the gear. He had the knowledge. He had done everything right every single time until the one time it didn't matter. This is his story. And I want you to pay attention, because the scariest part isn't what the cave did to him. It's what he asked it to do. The rescue team found him on day 14, sitting in total darkness, completely still, journal open across his knees. He wasn't unconscious. His eyes were open. He just wasn't blinking. One of the team members later said the moment their headlamps hit his face, something in her stomach dropped. Not because he looked injured or in pain, but because he looked settled, like a man who had decided some time ago that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. They timed it. 40 minutes from the moment they reached him to the moment they got him to the surface. 40 minutes of rappelling, securing him, attaching the harness, calling up to the team above. He didn't blink once. His name was Joel. 33. 7 years of solo hiking across British Columbia, the kind of experience level where the hobby stops being recreation and starts being something closer to a discipline. He filed route plans with 3 separate people before every trip. He carried backup batteries, backup maps, a laminated emergency card. He was the person in the group who knew the symptoms of altitude sickness before anyone else started feeling them. January. A cave system he'd actually visited before, twice in warmer months. Not an unmarked wilderness gamble. A documented site, accessible, photographed, written up in regional hiking guides. He had pictures of the interior on his phone. He knew the layout. The shaft wasn't in any of them. He described it in his journal as a non-event, almost. No crumbling, no warning sound, no dramatic lurch, just a step that kept going. 18 feet of freefall, then stone. His bag caught on something on the way down and stayed up there. Everything else made it. The headlamp, the water bottle, the journal with the pen still clipped to the cover. He ran his hands over his body the way he'd been trained to. Nothing broken. Nothing bleeding badly enough to matter. His first entry is almost boring in how composed it is. He inventoried what he had. He noted the temperature. He found a seam in the wall where water was dripping slowly enough to collect in his bottle cap. He wrote, in clean, even handwriting, that he expected to be out within 2 days. Then he underlined it. He was not out in 2 days. Days 1 through 5, his entries don't read like a man in crisis. They read like a man working a problem. Each attempt to climb the shaft walls is logged. Angle of approach, grip points tried, outcome, modification for next attempt. He was sleeping in shifts, staying warm by moving. His handwriting stays level, the letters consistent, the spacing tight and deliberate. Nothing about those first 5 days suggests what's coming. On day 6, he ate the mushrooms. There wasn't anything else. 6 days without food, and the only organic material in the chamber was growing along the lower wall. A pale, faintly luminescent growth he noticed only when he turned his headlamp off. He sat with the decision for a long time, wrote that he understood the risk, and then ate a small amount. Waited. Ate more. Wrote 1 line before apparently falling asleep. Stomach warm. No pain. Think I'll be all right. The next entry is 12 hours later. And the handwriting is different. Not dramatically at first. You'd have to hold the pages side by side. The letters are slightly taller. The pen pressure is heavier. You can feel the indentation through the next several pages if you run your thumb across them. But the thing that catches you isn't the physical change. It's the tone. He wrote that he felt completely at home. Not safe, not resigned, not making peace with a bad situation. At home. In a flooded stone shaft with no food and no viable exit. He wrote that the cave was quiet in a way he found genuinely comforting, that the walls felt warmer than they should when he pressed his palms against them, that he'd begun to notice patterns in the stone formations he hadn't paid attention to before. He wrote about them the way you'd write about something beautiful. He stopped writing about escape after day 8. Didn't mention the shaft, the rope, the climb. Just the cave itself. The smell of it, the texture of different wall sections, the exact pitch of the water dripping, which he described as almost musical. He started calling specific areas of the chamber by names he'd given them, the way you'd refer to rooms in a house you'd lived in a long time. Then, on day 9, the script changed. Not his handwriting, the actual characters. The letters he was forming were no longer letters. They were consistent, deliberate marks that followed internal rules, lines that repeated and referenced each other the way an alphabet does. But it wasn't any alphabet. 3 separate linguistic experts examined those pages independently, and each came back with the same answer. Unknown origin, no identifiable root language, no phonetic match to any documented writing system, living or extinct. What they couldn't agree on was this: the marks were not erratic. They were not the scrawl of someone losing motor function or coherence. If anything, they were more precise than his early entries. More confident. Whatever he was writing it fluently. The rescue team found him on day 14. Emergency beacon. He had apparently triggered it sometime in the first week and then, based on the journal, stopped thinking about it entirely. When they got to the surface with him, he was conscious, breathing normally, pulse present. Core temperature low but survivable. He didn't respond to his name. He didn't respond to the light. In the weeks after his discharge from hospital, he started speaking again. Slowly at first, and in a way that people around him struggled to describe. Not confused, not slow, just oddly formal. Like someone recalling a script rather than generating one. Neurological testing found nothing that had a clinical name. Nothing that had a treatment. His doctors used words like atypical and non-standard presentation, and eventually sent him home. The journal went to specialists. They kept the early pages. The later ones, the pages in the unidentified script, were returned after several months, quietly, with no published conclusions. One of the researchers involved later mentioned in an unrelated interview that she had stopped sleeping well during the period she was working with them, and that she hadn't agreed to examine material like that again. She didn't elaborate, and the interviewer didn't push. Joel doesn't remember writing any of it. He says this without any apparent distress, and that's the detail that stays with the people who know him. Not the mushrooms, not the script, not the 40 minutes without blinking. The fact that a man who used to laminate his emergency cards and underline his own promises to himself now has no curiosity at all about what happened to him in there. He doesn't ask what the pages say. He's never asked. The last page of the journal, the final one in the unknown script, has a single symbol near the bottom that one researcher noted appears in 2 other places in the document weeks apart in chronology. She flagged it as possibly functioning like punctuation, like an ending, like a period placed at the close of something finished. Whatever it meant, Joel put it there deliberately. You can tell by the pressure of the pen. He found the first shoe on a Tuesday. Small. Canvas. Blue laces still tied. It sat at the mouth of the lower passage like it had been placed there. Not dropped, not lost, placed. He photographed it. He logged it. He kept walking. The cave did not care that he was there. Sudwala had been closed to the public for 11 days by the time he arrived. A maintenance issue, the park office said. He had not believed them then. He believed them even less now. The air in the lower chamber was cool and constant. The kind that does not change with the season, the kind that has existed long before anyone alive today was born, and will exist long after. He noted that in his log. He noted everything. 22 years in cold cases had made him that kind of man. The cases that reached him were the ones where someone had already failed. Missed something small, dismissed something strange, moved too quickly through a room that deserved more time. He did not move quickly. That was not how he worked. The passage narrowed. He turned sideways, camera first, and pushed through. On the other side, a chamber. Natural. Unmodified. And on the floor of it, arranged in rows with a care that made him stop breathing entirely, shoes. Not 1. Not 2. Rows. He counted. His lips moved. When he reached 40, he stopped counting and simply held the light steady, moving it from one pair to the next. Each one small. Each one a child's. Each one different. A red boot, a brown sandal, a black school shoe with a Velcro strap, a sneaker with a cartoon character on the side, faded now, that cheerful little face watching him from across the floor of a cave in the dark. He crouched. He looked without touching. No dust on any of them. That was the detail. That was what changed the nature of the room. A cave accumulates dust the way water fills a valley. Slowly, without preference, without exception. Dust does not skip a surface. If there was no dust on these shoes had not been here long. Someone had placed them recently. Someone had come down here, arranged them in rows, and left. He stood up. He turned the light toward the back wall. He kept walking. The rows continued on both sides of him. He moved between them slowly, the light sweeping left and right, and every pair was pointing the same direction. Inward, toward the far wall, as if they had all been turned to face something. He stopped when he reached it. The wall looked like the rest of the chamber. Same gray rock, same calcite surface. But he had spent enough time in enclosed spaces to read a wall the way a doctor reads a face, and something about this one was wrong. He pressed his palm flat against it. It shifted, barely, a fraction of movement that said everything. He moved along the face slowly, both hands on the stone, until his left hand found it. The edge. Straight. Machined. The unmistakable geometry of something built rather than formed. A steel door, set flush into the rock and painted over, and in its latch, a padlock. Heavy. Clean. No rust. Recently used. He did not touch the padlock. He stepped back and looked at the door. Then he looked at the shoes behind him. Then the door again. He radioed for backup. Then he crouched and pressed his hand to the gap at the base of the door. That thin black line between steel and stone. Air moved against his palm. Not cave air, not that ancient still coldness, but directional air. Moving air. The kind that meant somewhere beyond this door, the earth continued. He sat with his back to the opposite wall and he breathed and he waited. Backup was 40 minutes out. He looked at his watch. He wrote down the time. He looked at the shoes. He breathed. He looked up. The padlock was gone. He had not heard a single thing. No footsteps. No scrape of metal. The padlock was simply gone, and the door was open. Not wide, not thrown back, just open enough. An inch. 2 inches. The gap of an invitation. He should have waited. He did not wait. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and stepped through into a room that did not belong inside a cave. Smooth concrete walls. A single battery lamp on a small table still burning. A chair. A shelf. And on the shelf a logbook, black cover, thick, the kind used for official records, for serious documentation, for the work of someone who understood that what they were doing mattered and needed to be preserved. He opened it. The first entry was dated March 1988. He turned pages slowly. Name, date, cause, name, date, cause. The handwriting even throughout, unhurried. The handwriting of a person for whom this had become as routine as logging mileage or recording weather. Page after page after page. He turned to the last entry. He read it. He stood very still. In 22 years he had found things. Behind walls, beneath floors, in the boots of cars in long-stay parking lots, that had required him to sit down before he could continue. This stopped him entirely. This was something he had no framework for. This was beyond the edge of everything his training had prepared him to absorb. The name in the last entry was one he knew. He knew it because he had last heard it 7 days ago, on a call from his sister. She'd sounded hollowed out. Flat in the way people get flat when the terror has been going for too long and the crying is finished and what's left is just words. Just information delivered in a monotone because falling apart isn't an option anymore. His nephew, 12 years old, reported missing the previous week. The date on the entry was 3 days ago. He turned the page. Different handwriting. Smaller. Careful. Said, "The detective will come. He always does." Said, "Leave the door open for him." He stood in the concrete room with the lamp burning yellow behind him and the logbook open in his hands and 200 pairs of shoes arranged in rows in the dark outside the door and back up 35 minutes away and the air in the room shifting. Not outward now, but inward, and he understood something that 22 years had not once prepared him for. He had not found this room. This room had been waiting for him. The lamp flickered once. Then it went out. The The stone dust was still falling when she realized the carving had her face. My name is Amara, and I study the dead things that people still believe in. That is the most precise way I know how to describe my work. I hold a doctorate from the University of the Volta Basin. I have published in 4 peer-reviewed journals. I have spent the better part of 2 decades cataloging sacred sites across West Africa with the same clinical detachment most people reserve for grocery lists. I say this not to establish credibility. I say this so you understand exactly how far I had to fall before I started listening. In the spring of 2016, I was granted access to a cave system inside the Atui mountain range in the Ashanti region. The elders of the surrounding village would have described the access differently. They would have said the cave does not grant entry. The cave endures it. If you arrive without the ritual, the cave simply begins its record. I did not perform the ritual. I arrived with 2 of my graduate students, Kweku and a quiet young woman named Efua, and I spent the better part of that first afternoon with a man named Kofi, who was the eldest of the site's custodians. Kofi was not what I expected. He was not theatrical. He did not speak in pronouncements. He had studied biology for 2 years at a polytechnic before returning to the village to care for his mother, and he had a habit of folding his reading glasses into his shirt pocket when he was about to say something important. He was, in other words, a practical man who happened to believe in the cave absolutely. He told me that in 1987, a French documentary crew had entered without the ritual. They had filmed for 3 hours. When the footage was reviewed, there was 40 minutes of black screen in the middle that no one could account for. One of the crew members retired from fieldwork the following year. He didn't say why. Kofi had spoken to that man by phone. Once. The man had not finished the call. I wrote all of this in my field notes. I did not absorb a single word. We entered at dawn the following morning. The first thing you notice about the interior of that cave is the silence. Not the absence of sound, a presence. Something dense that presses against the eardrums and makes you want to speak just to confirm you still can. The passage narrowed after roughly 40 meters, then opened into a primary chamber 20 meters wide, and extended further back in a series of corridors we had not yet mapped. The carvings began almost immediately. They covered the left wall of the chamber in dense, unbroken rows, each figure roughly the size of a human palm. They were not symbols. They were not hieroglyphs. They were people, rendered with a specificity that made the hair on my arms stand before I understood what I was looking at. Individual faces, individual postures, each one caught in a particular moment, a gesture, an expression, a way of holding the body when the hands are afraid. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. I moved closer with my lamp and the detail only increased. I could see the texture of fabric, the angle of a turned head, the white of a knuckle. Kweku was the one who noticed the progression. He moved slowly along the wall from left to right, not speaking, and then he stopped and said quietly that the clothing was changing. The earliest figures on the far left wore wrapped cloth belonging to centuries I work with in museums. Moving right, the garments shifted. Gradually, undeniably, transitional dress, colonial-era layers, then trousers, then jackets, then unmistakably modern things. A figure in jeans. A figure with a backpack strap across one shoulder. A figure holding something rectangular that, viewed from the right angle, looked very much like a mobile phone. I told myself there was a rational explanation. I told myself the rational explanation was probably fascinating and I was going to write about it in a very good paper. I did not feel afraid. I want you to understand that clearly because the fear came later, arrived from a specific place, and has never fully left. Efua found the figure with the notebook. She called to me from the far right end of the wall, her voice careful and even, the voice of someone choosing their footing on wet rock. I crossed the chamber to where she stood and looked at what she was looking at. A woman, kneeling, head tilted back, one hand holding a rectangular object, the other extended slightly forward for balance. The posture of someone leaning in to examine something at close range. The detail was extraordinary. Natural hair pulled back, a field jacket with multiple pockets. Around the neck, just visible, the loop of a lamp strap or an ID cord. I was wearing a field jacket with multiple pockets. My hair was natural, pulled back. My lamp strap was around my neck. I was holding a notebook. I want to tell you I reacted with composure. I did not. I stepped back and made a sound I have never made before or since. Something between a word and a breath, and then I stood very still and held on to the rational explanation with both hands. And I almost managed it, right up until I looked at the base of the carving and saw the stone dust. Fresh, not ancient, not the settled pale residue that clings to old stone. Fresh and white and still drifting. The way stone dust moves when someone is cutting rock in this very moment, in this very place, and the vibration of the work is still in the air. Kweku said we should leave. I agreed with a speed that my training did not permit. We moved toward the entrance without gathering equipment, without any of the careful systematic withdrawal that 2 decades of fieldwork had taught me. We simply moved. And then Efua stopped and said, very quietly, that the passage seemed shorter than before. She was right. The entrance corridor, which had admitted us at full standing height, was now perhaps 2 feet lower. I know how that sounds. I know every alternative explanation, rock displacement, a trick of the light, the disorientation that enclosed spaces and elevated stress can produce in the human visual system. I have considered all of them. The ceiling above the passage was not fractured, not displaced, not rough with fresh breakage. It was smooth and complete and simply closer to the floor than it had been when we arrived. We got down on our hands and knees and we crawled out, and we did not stop moving until we were standing in warm air with the mountain behind us. Kofi was at the edge of the path. He looked at us with an expression that contained no surprise, no triumph, no mysticism of any kind. He just folded his reading glasses into his shirt pocket and handed Efua a bottle of water and said nothing, which was the kindest response available to him. I published my research 8 months later. I documented the carvings. I analyzed the temporal stratification of the figures as evidence of continuous ritual practice across multiple centuries. I wrote about the craftsmanship. I did not include the figure that looked like me. I told myself it was a methodological decision. I think, if I am honest, it was fear wearing the clothing of professionalism. The response was positive. The paper was cited. And then, 14 months after publication, I received an email from a peer reviewer working on a regional anthology. He had questions about one of the photographs, specifically, a carving visible in the background of an image taken near the deepest section of the back corridor. A section we had not entered. A section Kweku and I had decided not to explore because the passage had become too low and we had not wanted to go further in. The reviewer wanted to know about the 3 figures in that carving. They were walking away from the camera, he wrote, moving toward what appeared to be a bright opening. The detail was remarkable. He could make out the soles of their shoes quite clearly. He asked if I knew what kind of shoes they were. I opened the photograph. I looked at the 3 figures carved in stone, walking away from me toward a brightness that had no source I could explain in a chamber that receives no natural light. I looked at the shoes. I recognized all 3 pairs. I recognized the field jacket on the figure in the center. I recognized the way the figure on the right carries weight, slightly forward, left shoulder lower, the specific posture of someone who spends long hours bent over a desk. Below the carving, in Chui script, were 4 words. I know what they say. I am not going to repeat them here. I have spent 7 years telling myself that repeating them changes something, that the cave is still listening, that whatever is making those carvings has not finished, and that the only thing standing between me and the next fall of stone dust is the small mercy of staying quiet. The villagers warned her not to speak inside the cave. She laughed. Once. Her name was Valentina. She had been mapping caves for 21 years. That matters because what follows only makes sense if you understand what 21 years of underground work does to a person's relationship with evidence. It does not make them superstitious. It makes them more precise. Every measurement gets recorded. Every feature gets cross-referenced. You do not guess in a cave. Guessing underground can kill you. So you learn over 2 decades to trust only what you can put a number on. You learn to love the number more than the theory. The number does not lie. The number does not imagine things. This is the story of what happened when the numbers stopped making sense. Valentina had grown up in Bogota, the second of 3 children, in an apartment that backed against a hill. Her mother taught secondary school mathematics. Her father was a structural engineer who brought blueprints home and left them on the kitchen table, and she would sit across from them and trace the lines with her finger before she was old enough to know what they meant. She understood early that some people moved through the world looking at surfaces, and some people needed to know what was underneath. She was the second kind. She studied geology at university, then technical illustration, then spent 2 years working with a hydrology team mapping underground water systems in Cundinamarca before she found the specific work that would occupy the rest of her professional life. Cave cartography, the making of maps for places that had never had one. She was good at it from the beginning, and then she got better, and then she became the kind of person that institutions contacted when they had a passage no one else had been able to render accurately. By 2021, she had mapped more than 300 kilometers of underground passage across 6 countries. She had published papers. She had trained younger cartographers. She had a reputation for producing maps that other people used as the standard against which their own work was measured. She was not someone who made errors. She was not someone who invented things. She was 41 years old, and she had spent her adult life being the most reliable person in the room. In early 2021, she was contracted to extend the documentation of a cave system in Colombia's Huila department. The system had been partially mapped, the main chambers, the tourist routes, the passages that hydrologists and biologists had worked through over the previous decades. But at its deeper end, beyond a particular geological formation that had historically discouraged further exploration, there were passages with no record. Her job was to go in, take measurements, produce a first draft, and return. Standard work, the kind she had done hundreds of times. Her permits were current. The documentation confirming her status as the first technical cartographer to enter this specific section was signed by 2 institutional bodies and timestamped. She had her assistant drive her to the trailhead before dawn. She hiked in alone, which was normal for initial mapping work. A second person in a tight passage creates interference, disturbs sediment, makes the measurements less clean. She preferred to do first entry solo and bring support personnel on subsequent visits. She entered the cave system at 6:06 in the morning. The first hour was orientation. She moved through the documented sections, familiar territory, mapped by others, nothing she needed to record. She was heading for the unmarked zone, which began past a limestone formation that pinched the passage to roughly shoulder width before opening again. She had photographs of this pinch point from a colleague's visit 2 years prior. She knew what to expect. She passed through it at 6:49 and found herself in an undocumented chamber. She spent 14 minutes measuring and recording the chamber, its dimensions, its features, the texture of its walls, the condition of its floor. She noted 2 secondary passages leading off from it. She chose the larger of the 2, marked its position on her working map, checked her compass bearing, and went in. The passage ran for roughly 60 meters before its first turn. She mapped as she walked, pacing distances, noting irregularities, marking the ceiling profile. It was good passage, consistent width, stable floor, no obvious hazards. She was perhaps 40 minutes into this section, working methodically, when she came around a long curve in the rock and her headlamp lit up the wall ahead. There was something on it. She stopped walking. She stood and looked at it from where she was, 6 or 7 meters away, before she moved any closer. This is standard practice. You assess before you approach, because sometimes what looks like an object on a wall is a feature of the wall itself, and the act of getting close changes it. She looked at it for several seconds. It did not change. It was a sheet of paper, pinned to the rock with a single masonry nail. She walked to it and held her lamp close. It was a map. Graph paper, the same brand she used, the same grid weight, the same pale ruling. Pencil. Her pencil weight. And the notation, the symbols, the shorthand, the specific marks she used for passage features were hers. Not similar to hers. Not the standard notation that any cartographer might use. Her private system, including symbols she had developed herself over 20 years and never published, never taught, never shared in any form outside her own field notebooks. The map showed the passage she was standing in. Every turn she had made in the last 40 minutes was on it, accurate to the centimeter as far as she could determine without laying the two maps side by side. And beyond where she stood, the pre-made map continued, showing features she had not yet reached. She did not panic. That is not a compliment designed to make her seem heroic. It is simply what she did. She had spent 2 decades in situations where panic was not an option, and the habit was so ingrained that it functioned even now, when what she was looking at had no framework that could contain it. Her heart rate increased. Her hands were steady. She documented everything. She photographed the map in place. She photographed the nail. She recorded the time, 7:31. She wrote in her field log, found pre-existing map, apparent match to personal notation system, location confirmed as undocumented passage, no prior entry on record. She carefully removed the map from the wall, preserved the nail in a sample bag, folded the map, and placed it in her breast pocket. Then she stood in the passage for a moment and made a decision. She kept going, because the job was not done, and she did not yet have enough data to know what had happened, and leaving now would mean abandoning the mapping work without a resolution. She was a professional. She would collect more information, and then she would form a conclusion, and then she would take appropriate action. That was the process. That was how you worked. The pre-made map was accurate for every meter she walked. She checked it continuously against her own measurements. Junction ahead, correct. Ceiling drop, correct. A section of unusually smooth wall on the eastern side, marked and present. She began to develop a sensation she could not name. Not fear exactly, but a kind of cognitive pressure, as though her mind was working very hard to maintain a structure that the evidence was pressing against. She noted this in her log too. She wrote, experiencing perceptual dissonance, maintaining systematic approach. On page 7 of the pre-made map, in the left margin, there was a symbol she had not seen in her own work before. It was a small circle bisected by a line at 45 degrees, with 2 short hash marks on the upper arc. She looked at it for a long time. It was not a symbol from the standard notation system. It was not a symbol from her own private notation system. She was certain of that. She was less certain, and this was the detail that would trouble her most later when she had the distance to examine it, about something else. That morning, before her alarm, she had lain awake thinking about a cartographic problem. How do you notate a passage that has an atmospheric anomaly? Not a structural risk, not a water feature, but a change in air pressure, a subtle wrongness in the way the space felt. The standard system had no symbol for this. She had been composing one in her mind. She had not written it down. She had simply pictured it, with the intention of formalizing it later. The symbol in the margin looked like the one she had pictured. She wrote in her log, marginal symbol, unidentified, possible prior notation coincidence, investigate provenance. She kept going. The passage ran on for another 100 meters before it ended. The final chamber was small, 3 meters across, perhaps 2.5 high. Fine silt on the floor, undisturbed by any footfall she could identify. The walls were pale stone, smooth, the kind of smoothness that accumulates over geological time rather than human intervention. On the far wall, someone had drawn a face. It was not a rough sketch. It was a careful drawing, detailed, the kind produced by someone who had looked at their subject for a long time and understood how to render what they saw. The jaw was correct. The slight asymmetry in the brows was correct. The 3 small lines at the corner of the left eye that she had noticed herself in mirrors were correct. It was her face. Beside it, in her handwriting, there were exit instructions, compass bearings, which passages to take at each junction, the location of the ceiling drop where she would need to remove her pack. All of it, she would later confirm, accurate. She sat on the floor of that chamber for approximately 12 minutes. She recorded that she sat, and for how long, because she was still logging, because the logging was the thing she held onto when nothing else was stable. Then she stood, folded the pre-made map back into her breast pocket, and followed the instructions out. Her assistant found her at the trailhead at 14:20, sitting on a boulder near the path junction. He would later tell her colleagues that she seemed physically present but was not responding to questions in any normal way. She was looking at the ground, and when he spoke to her she would turn her head in his direction but not answer for several seconds. This lasted roughly 20 minutes. Then she said clearly that she needed water and that she needed to make some calls. He gave her water. She made calls. She was transported to a hospital in Bogota that afternoon. She spent 3 days there. The physical findings were straightforward. Exhaustion, mild dehydration, elevated cortisol consistent with acute stress. Neurologically, there was nothing remarkable. She slept badly for all 3 nights, which the staff noted but which Valentina herself could have predicted. When she closed her eyes, she was still in that chamber, sitting on the silt floor, looking at her own face on the wall. Her sister came from Medellin and stayed for 2 days. They talked about things that had nothing to do with the cave. Their mother, a nephew who had started school, a property dispute involving their grandmother's house that had been pending for years. Valentina was grateful for this. She did not want to talk about the cave with someone who loved her. She was not yet sure what there was to say. Her colleagues came separately. They were more careful with her than she expected, and she realized, watching them be careful, that she looked worse than she felt. She told them the factual sequence of events. She showed them the photographs. She let them look at the pre-made map, which she had kept sealed in a document sleeve from the moment she left the cave. They looked at it for a long time without speaking. The psychiatrist who reviewed her case was a small, methodical woman with reading glasses pushed up into her hair. She reviewed the full history, the episode in the cave, the physical findings, Valentina's medical background. Valentina had a documented history of complex sleepwalking, most severe under periods of professional stress. Previous episodes had involved extended walking, dressing, and on one occasion preparing a meal with no memory of having done so. The psychiatrist said this history was relevant context. She did not say it was the answer. Valentina understood the proposed framework. If she had produced the map during a stress-induced fugue state, driven to the trailhead, hiked 2 hours in, entered the cave, mapped the passage in full, produced a face drawing that she had then forgotten, the notation would be hers because it was hers. The accuracy of the features ahead of where she consciously stood would be explained by an earlier unconscious walk she had no memory of making. She sat with this for a long time. It broke on the symbol she had not yet drawn when she left for the cave that morning. The symbol she had only imagined, lying in bed before dawn, which appeared in the margin of a map she had supposedly made without knowing it. For that symbol to be there, she would need to have invented it during the fugue state, independently, matching what she had pictured in her waking mind hours before. Not impossible, but a different order of coincidence than everything else. She returned to field work 8 months later. Not to Huila, but to a different system in Santander with a full team on a project she had already committed to before any of this happened. Her colleagues said she was unchanged in her methodology. The same care, the same precision, the same quality of map at the end of each session. She told one colleague, over a meal on the 4th night of that expedition, that she had stopped looking for an explanation that closed the question. Not because she had accepted what she found as something beyond explanation, but because every framework she built collapsed at the same point, and she had too much experience with unresolved measurements to pretend she had resolved this one. You document what you found. You note where your models fail. You do not force a conclusion when the data does not support one. That was the discipline. That was what 21 years underground had actually taught her. She still maps caves. She still uses her private notation system. She has not encountered the symbol from the margin again, and she has not formally added it to her system, though she has a page in her current notebook where it is sketched, with a question mark beside it, and below that, in small careful letters, a note that reads, "Conditions of first appearance unknown. Conditions of valid use pending." She is still waiting to find out what it means. The last thing she read before signing was the header. Federal Survey Agreement, Harz Region, Lower Saxony. 12 pages. She initialed each one. She did not read what she was agreeing to. That is the part she cannot forgive herself for. Not what she found. Not what was done to her. The form. The 12 pages she folded neatly and handed back to a man whose name she never asked for. Her name is Lena. She is a federal geologist. Was She is 36 years old and she has not worked since October. The agency contacted her in September. Routine structural survey, they said. Restricted zone, ecological sensitivity. A cave system beneath the Harz Mountains, depth unknown, access controlled. She would have an escort to the inner checkpoint. Standard clearance protocol. She had done exactly this kind of work 14 times before in her career. It never occurred to her to ask why the zone was restricted, or who exactly was calling it ecological. The escort met her at a checkpoint 40 minutes from the nearest town. Gray jacket, clipboard, no name offered. He drove her to the cave entrance in silence, handed her a keycard, and said she was cleared through the first interior gate. He would wait at the surface. She assumed the card was standard entry clearance. She was wrong about what it opened. Inside, the cave was the kind of beautiful that geologists keep to themselves. She knows that sounds strange given what she is about to tell you, but she wants you to understand what normal felt like because normal is important to what came after. The passage ran 300 meters into the mountain. She worked for 3 hours. She took samples. She logged data. She was doing exactly what she was paid to do. The side passage was not on her map. She noticed it at the 2-hour mark. A branch corridor cut to the left, angled downward, with no geological reason to exist. Natural caves do not run at that angle, at that depth, with those wall surfaces. Someone made this. She followed it for 40 meters. At the end, a steel door set flush into the rock face. Not rusted, not old, maintained. The electronic lock was new. She tells people she hesitated. That is not entirely true. She pressed the keycard to the panel because the keycard was in her hand and the door was there. A scientist sees an opening. She opens it. What she did not expect was for the card to work. She had been given clearance to the first checkpoint. The door at the end of an unlisted passage 40 meters off the surveyed route should not have opened for her. It opened immediately. The lights came on automatically. Fluorescent. Industrial. The room was large, filing cabinets floor to ceiling, every wall, labeled by year. The ventilation was running. The air was clean and temperature controlled. On the desk at the far end, a water bottle. She touched it, still cold. Someone had been in this room recently. That thought arrived before any other. The years on the cabinet labels began in 1946. She understood what that year meant in the context of German history, in the context of what that generation of German institutions had done. She opened the first drawer. The files inside were medical records, patient files, names she could not place: German, Polish, Czech, Hungarian. She is not a physician. She does not need to be one to recognize that what those files described was not medicine. She closed the drawer. She stood very still. Then she made the decision that scientists make. She would find the most recent files, photograph them, and report through official channels. She still believed at that point in official channels. The cabinet for the current year, 2019, was at the far end of the room. She opened it. 3 folders, thinner than the others. Still being compiled, she thought. She pulled the first one. Her own photograph was paper-clipped to the inside cover. She will describe what she felt as a specific kind of cold. Not fear, not disbelief, but the sensation of every assumption in your mind going very quiet at once. Her name, her national identification number, her employment history, her complete medical history, accurate down to a minor surgical procedure she had undergone privately at a small clinic in Frankfurt 3 months prior. A procedure she had told no one about, not her employer, not her family. The file described the surgery in precise clinical detail. The instruments, the anesthesia dosage, the duration, all accurate, all exactly as it had happened. She turned to the last page. Under a heading that read "Only Procedure Notes," there was one final line. She read it. She closed the file. She put it back in the drawer exactly as she had found it. She walked 40 meters back down the side passage, 300 meters through the main corridor, and out into the gray October light. The escort was waiting. He said nothing unusual. She said nothing at all. He drove her to the checkpoint. She drove herself home. For 8 days she told herself she was being strategic. On the 9th day, she tried to access her own surgical records through the clinic's patient portal. The account existed. The records did not. She called the clinic. They placed her on hold. They returned and told her there was no patient file under her name. She asked to speak to her surgeon. He was unavailable. She called the following morning. A different receptionist told her the same surgeon had no record of treating anyone by her name. She asked if they could check again. They said they had checked twice. She has checked herself every morning since. The scar is still there, healing correctly on the right timeline in exactly the right place. The body does not forget. But every institution that should hold the record of what happened to it has nothing. No appointment, no consent form, no surgeon's notes, no file, except the one in the cave. She has written everything down. Every measurement, every date, every word she can remember from those 3 hours underground. She has given it to someone she trusts with instructions that it is to be opened under specific circumstances she will not describe. The final line, the one on the last page of her file under procedure notes. She has not said it yet, and she is aware of that. She is saying it now. It read, "Subject will not remember consenting. Subject will not need to. She remembers. She does not know if that was an error. She does not know if it was intentional. She does not know which of those two possibilities is worse." She signed the form, all 12 pages. She did not read it carefully. She is 36 years old. She is a trained scientist, and she trusted the institution. She understands now what the form contained. She will not tell you the specific language. She will say only that it was precise, that it was legal, and that somewhere in those 12 pages, she gave her consent to something she will spend the rest of her life trying to understand. The scar is there. The records are not. And in a sealed chamber beneath the Harz Mountains, in a filing cabinet labeled with the current year, her file is still open. The cave does not welcome you. It tolerates you the way deep water tolerates a stone, briefly and without warmth. Ronan had been underground for 11 hours when he saw it. Not directly, never directly. It entered his world the way all dangerous things do, at the very edge of perception, in the soft blur where the eye stops trying. He was cataloging. That was all. Blind shrimp, cave beetles, the pale thread-like fungi that grow in places where light has never once arrived. He was methodical, scientific. He had learned, over years of fieldwork, to look at the world the way a surgeon looks at a body, without flinching, without projecting, without fear. That discipline would nearly kill him. It was the size that registered first. Not a shape. His brain refused to assemble a shape from what he was seeing, but a scale. A mass. Something hanging from the ceiling of the chamber approximately 30 meters ahead, at the outer rim of his headlamp's reach. Layered, pale, absolutely still. His first thought was geological. A formation. Mineral deposits could produce extraordinary shapes in quartzite systems. Sheets of crystal, curtains of flowstone, columns that looked almost biological. His second thought arrived before he could stop it. It moved. Not much. Not dramatically. The way a sleeping animal shifts when it senses something has changed in the room. A slow, involuntary adjustment. A recalibration. Ronan's headlamp was pointed directly at it now. He would later try to explain what happened next. He would use words like dropped and descended and came down. None of them were accurate. The organism, and some part of his brain had already accepted that word, organism, had already filed the appropriate mental paperwork. Simply transitioned from ceiling to floor with a speed and silence that made the space between the two positions feel irrelevant. It was closer. He turned off his light. The darkness in a deep cave is not the darkness of a room with the curtains closed. It is not the darkness of a moonless field or a windowless basement. It is the oldest darkness on Earth, the darkness that existed before eyes evolved a reason to exist. It has texture. Wait, it presses against your face like something that has been waiting. In that darkness, for feet away, something breathed. Not loudly, not menacingly. With the same patient, mechanical regularity of a machine performing a function it has performed for a very long time. Ronan did not breathe. Ronan stood with his eyes open in the absolute dark, aware that opening and closing his eyes made no difference whatsoever, and tried to think. He was a scientist. He ran the available data. The organism had not reacted to the sound of his boots on the cave floor. It had not reacted to the temperature differential of his body heat in a space that hovered near 11 degrees Celsius. It had not reacted when he'd entered the chamber. It had reacted precisely when his headlamp, when he had looked directly at it. And when he had stopped looking, it had stopped. He ran the hypothesis again because the hypothesis was insane. It sensed observation, not light, not heat, not vibration, the neurological event of focused conscious attention, the specific cognitive act of looking at something on purpose. He was a biologist. He knew that stranger sensory systems existed: electroreception, magnetoreception, infrared sensitivity in pit organs. The natural world was full of organisms that perceived things humans couldn't imagine perceiving. There was no reason, no scientific reason, why an organism evolving in a system of total sensory deprivation over millions of years couldn't develop sensitivity to the one remaining signal that still entered its environment: the bioelectric signature of a focused human mind. He had approximately 4 kilometers of cave passage between himself and the surface. He could not look directly at anything. The next 6 hours exist in Ronan's memory as a series of textures: the rough quartzite under his fingertips, the cold of the stone floor through his knee pads when he crawled, the sound of his own breathing, which he worked to keep shallow. Not because sound mattered, but because hyperventilation would cost him the controlled cognition he could not afford to lose. He navigated by peripheral vision, by touch, by the memory of the passage maps he had studied before descent. He moved the way prey animals move when they know a predator is close, not fast, not slow, but deliberate. Each movement chosen rather than reactive. The breathing followed him, not always at the same distance, sometimes further back 10-15 meters tracking at a lag, sometimes close enough that he felt the displacement of air. Once, for nearly 40 minutes, he could not hear it at all, and that was worse. The known threat had become unknown again, and unknown threats live in every shadow simultaneously. He dropped his camera somewhere in the lower passages. He didn't stop. He couldn't afford to stop. He reached the surface entrance as gray pre-dawn light was beginning to filter through the cave mouth. He did not run the last 100 meters. Running requires looking forward. He walked sideways, pressing his back against the cave wall, watching the passage behind him with his peripheral vision until the gradient of actual light told him he was outside. He sat on the hillside in the thin morning air and did not look back into the cave for a very long time. The biology team entered 6 days later. 6 researchers, full documentation equipment, a complete survey protocol. They found nothing.
No organism. No biological traces.
No physical evidence of anything unusual in the chamber where Ronan's GPS tracker showed he had spent the longest portion of his underground time. The cave was empty in the specific way that old, deep caves are empty, comprehensively, permanently, indifferently. They found his camera on the passage floor, exactly where he'd dropped it. The footage from the first portion of the recording was intact. Standard documentation work.
Cave formation.
Specimen collection. Ronan's voice, calm and technical, narrating measurements into the audio track. Then, the moment he entered the large chamber, every frame after that point was black. Not corrupted, not overexposed. Black in the way a lens looks when something is covering it. Carefully, from the outside. The audio, however, continued. For 6 hours, the microphone recorded. Silence, mostly. Ronan's breathing. The distant sound of water somewhere far below. His footsteps, and then, behind his footsteps, something else. Something that made the team's audio technician stop the playback and sit very still for a moment before pressing play again. Near the end of the recording, barely audible, Ronan's voice. Don't look at it. Then silence. Then, at a frequency just slightly lower than a human voice, with a cadence that almost matched the rhythm of human speech. Too late. The team submitted their report.
No organism.
No evidence. Investigation closed pending further review. Ronan no longer works in field biology. He does not enter dark rooms without first turning the light on from outside. He has not explained why, when he sits at a restaurant or in a lecture hall, he always chooses the seat facing the wall. He says it is a preference. He does not say what he learned, in 6 hours of absolute darkness, about the difference between being watched and knowing you are watched. He does not say what he understood, somewhere in the middle of those passages, when the breathing behind him briefly changed, became quieter, more careful, as though something had realized that it, too, could be perceived at the edges, as though something had learned from him in real time how to hide. He does not say any of this, but sometimes in conversation he will pause, and very briefly he will look at something that isn't there, and then he will look away. "9 hours. That's how long I was missing before anyone found me. And the strangest part, the part that still makes me sit up in the dark at 3 in the morning, is that the whole time I wasn't alone. I need you to stay with me here, because what I'm about to tell you is going to sound like something I invented. I promise you I didn't. I have the cave mud still in the soles of those boots. I have the timestamp on every photo. I have the face of a senior guide going the exact color of old ash when he heard her name. None of this is invented. None of it has ever been explained. Domica is a cave system that runs beneath the Slovak-Hungarian border, and it is genuinely beautiful. Stalactites like cathedral organs. Underground rivers the color of glacier melt. A tourist route that takes about 90 minutes. Marked, lit, guided. I had been traveling alone for 4 months by then. Solo, backpacking, filming everything for a blog that maybe 300 people read. Domica was on my list because of a photograph I'd seen. This long corridor of formations glowing orange under the guide lights. I wanted that image. I went on a Thursday in early October, when the season was winding down and the group was small. 8 people, 1 guide, and me. I fell behind at the 3rd chamber. I know exactly where it happened because I have a timestamp on a photograph I took of a flowstone curtain, 11:47 in the morning. I was trying to get the angle right, crouching low, adjusting the exposure on my phone. When I stood up, the group was gone. The guide lights around the corner were still on, so I wasn't panicked. I just walked quickly to catch up. Except the path forked. I didn't remember a fork. I stood there for a moment, listening for voices, and heard nothing except the drip of water somewhere below me. I chose left. I walked for 5 minutes. I walked for 10. The path kept going and the lights kept working and I kept telling myself I was fine. That's when I met her. She was standing in a wider section of the passage, looking at a formation on the wall with the calm, unhurried posture of someone who had done this 100 times. She turned when she heard me and she smiled, easy, immediate, the way old friends smile. She said she had fallen behind too. Her name was Petra. She said she knew the cave from childhood, that her father had been a guide here, that she had walked these passages more times than she could count. She said she knew the way out. I want to be very careful how I describe her, because I've been asked to describe her many times since that day, and what I keep coming back to is this. She was completely ordinary. Not unervingly ordinary. Not the wrong kind of ordinary. Just a woman in her late 30s, maybe early 40s. Brown hair pulled back. A dark green quilted jacket. Good hiking boots. She smelled like cold stone and something faintly sweet, like the inside of a thermos. She talked the way competent people talk. Practical, a little dry, interested in the details. She asked where I was from. She asked what I was photographing. She pointed out formations I would have walked past and told me their local names in Slovak and then, without being asked, translated each one. We walked for what I thought was an hour. It was not an hour. The cave deepened. The passages narrowed. There were sections I had to turn sideways to move through, and Petra moved through them without hesitation, always a few steps ahead, always pausing to make sure I was following. The lights became more sparse, not absent, but further apart, and a different color, less yellow, more blue-white, colder. I told myself these were the older sections of the installation. I told myself lots of things. We stopped to rest in a chamber large enough to sit down. I took out my phone to check the time and the battery was at 11%. It was 14:22. I had been in the cave for nearly 3 hours. I opened my photos, meaning to delete duplicates and save what power I had left. And that's when I found it. Or rather, that's when I didn't find it. 3 hours of photographs. Hundreds of them. The formations I remembered. The fork in the path. The narrow section where I turned sideways. And in every single one of them, every single one, I was alone. There were photographs where I remembered Petra standing right beside me. Her hand had been on my arm at one point, pointing at something above us. I had turned to look at her face while she was speaking and thought, I should photograph this person, this moment, and I had not done it. Or I had done it and she was not there. I cannot tell you which is true. I can only tell you what the screen showed me. I asked her to take a photo of me. I said I wanted to send something to my family, let them know I was okay, make it look casual. She took my phone without hesitation. She positioned me with my back to a section of pale cave wall. She held the phone up, looked at the screen, and then she handed it back to me. She said quietly, "It came out well. It did come out well. I am in the photo in sharp focus, my forced smile clearly a forced smile. The cave wall behind me is pale and close and detailed, and in the soft mud at my feet, mud that had been undisturbed when I walked into that chamber, mud I had watched my own boots press into when I sat down, there are 2 sets of footprints.
Mine.
And another set, the same size as mine, 1/2 meter to my left, where she had been standing. I did not say anything. I put my phone back in my pocket. My hands were not shaking. I think that's the strangest detail. My hands were completely still. We walked for what turned out to be another 4 hours. She talked. I answered. We navigated 6 more passages. She knew every one. At no point did I feel I was in danger. That is the part one cannot reconcile and have never been able to reconcile. I was never afraid of her. Even when I knew something was wrong, even when I was holding photographic evidence of something I could not explain, I was not afraid of her. She was kind. She was calm. She was, in every way that I know how to measure, completely safe. The exit came without announcement. One passage, then another, and then there was daylight, gray October daylight, thin and cold, and beyond it I could hear voices. Staff voices.
Urgent.
I stepped out of the cave and 2 guides grabbed my arms and someone behind me said thank God and someone else was already reaching for a phone. I had been missing for 9 hours and 14 minutes. When I was warm enough to speak clearly, I described her. I did it the way you're supposed to describe someone, methodically, from the top down. Hair, face, jacket, boots, the way she moved, the way she held her head slightly to the side when she listened. A senior guide was sitting across from me, and I watched his face change while I talked. Not dramatically, just a settling like something confirming itself. He stood up without saying anything and went into a small room behind the reception desk. He came back holding a piece of laminated paper. Old lamination, yellowing at the edges. He set it down in front of me without speaking. A missing person's notice. The kind you print when someone doesn't come home from somewhere. There was a photograph in the corner, a woman. Brown hair. A dark green quilted jacket.
Petra.
Gone missing in the restricted section of this cave. 14 years earlier. September 2009. The guide said there had been 3 other incidents over those 14 years. 3 other tourists who had gotten separated and lost, deep inside, and who had been guided out by a friendly local woman who knew the cave. Every one of them had made it out safely. In all 4 cases, including mine, cave staff had checked the entrance records, the exit records, the ranger logs. There was no record of her entering on any of those days. There was no record of her entering on any day after September 2009. He said this quietly, like someone reciting a fact about the weather. Then he looked at the laminated paper for a moment longer, and he said the thing that has followed me every night since. He said, "We don't know why she stays. We don't know why she only helps." He paused. "We are grateful that she does. I didn't sleep that night. I'm not sure I've slept properly since. Not because I'm afraid, but because every explanation I reach for, every rational frame I try to fit this into, leaves 2 sets of footprints in the mud.
Mine.
And hers. And no answer for why she never follows anyone back out.